Late one night in January 1978, a rock star sat in a dimly lit California bungalow with a beer in one hand and a pistol in the other. Kath, the ferociously talented guitarist and co-founder of the band Chicago, was in a restless, intoxicated haze. He had spent days on a cocaine binge and now fiddled casually with one of his beloved guns. Laughing off a friend's pleas to be careful, Kath removed the magazine from a 9mm pistol and held it up. "Look, the clip's not even in it," he assured his buddy. There's never been a more gut-wrenching example of famous last words. The tragic end of Kath's life still haunts those who knew him. So, how did he end up in such a dark place? Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Terry Allen Kath was born on January 31st, 1946 in the Norwood Park area of Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a close-knit musical family. His father, Raymond, and mother, Evelyn, loved hosting lively gatherings at a lodge they ran, filling the air with music and laughter. Terry's mum played banjo and his older brother drummed, so it was no surprise that young Terry tried his hand at various instruments. He first picked up the accordion and piano, then the drums, and finally the guitar as a teenager. Unlike some future bandmates who took formal lessons, Terry was largely self-taught and happiest jamming by ear. "All I wanted to do was play those rock and roll chords," he later shrugged of his brief attempt at guitar lessons. By 9th grade, he had his own guitar and amp and was thrashing out some tunes inspired by early rock and jazz players like the Ventures, Johnny Smith, and Wes Montgomery. Once Terry discovered the thrill of those 6 strings, there was no turning back. Not everyone was quite as enthusiastic about his musical ambitions. Terry's father hoped he'd go for a more stable profession and was uneasy about his son's all-or-nothing rock and roll dreams. But Terry was a headstrong kid. In the mid-1960s, while still a teenager at Taft High School in Chicago, he started gigging with local bands. At 17, he joined a cover band called the Mystics, where he cycled between playing guitar and bass on the bustling Midwest club circuit. His talent on both bass and guitar was obvious even then, and so was his tenacious resolve. Terry had a charisma that drew people in. He had a charming smile, sure, but one that masked a much deeper intensity. He wasn't going to settle for a day job when music was in his blood. In 1965, Terry joined a semi-pro outfit called Jimmy Ford and the Executives, playing bass as they were grinding out top 40 tunes in Chicago lounges. It was in this band that he met 2 of the most important people in his life, drummer Danny Seraphine and classically trained saxophonist Walt Parazada. These guys were 2 kindred musical spirits who would become Terry's closest collaborators. Seraphine was a street kid running with a tough crowd until music plucked him from a potential gang life. Seraphine later remembered, "Once I got that gig, my life changed." The burly, 6'2" Kath quickly emerged as a leader in the band. He had a vision for bigger, bolder music and the force of personality to push others towards it. "He always reminded me of Robert Mitchum, a real man's man," Seraphine said. But beneath Terry's easygoing exterior, his new mates realized a dangerous undercurrent was flowing. Something darker lurking behind the smiles, as Seraphine put it later. Now, here's a bit of very exciting news that I think many of you are going to love. I've started a new channel. It's very much the same format as this one, only I'll be covering fascinating figures from beyond the music and movie world. It's called Society Mysteries, and I put the first video out just yesterday, all about the marvelous and extremely interesting life of Penelope Tree, the 60s muse who blew the minds of everyone from David Bailey to John Lennon, and then dramatically simply disappeared in the most unusual way. There's a link to the channel on screen and in the description. I'll be hugely obliged if you go give that video a watch after this one and help me get the channel off to a good start. Also, hitting the subscribe button would be just magical. I'd love it to be a success. And I've got plenty more planned. If you have any suggestions for figures I could cover, go leave a comment on the Penelope Tree video, and I'll take them all on board. I'm all ears on this one. Hope you'll enjoy it. Now let's get back to Terry Kath's road to Chicago. Terry's first shot at the big time nearly crashed before it began. In 1966, Jimmy Ford agreed to merge his band with another local act called Little Artie and the Pharaohs. This should have been a step up for Jimmy Ford and the rest of his band. For Ford it was, but for Kath it was a different story. Little Artie's management summarily fired Terry, Danny and Walt, and they were left with a cold business line dismissal by Little Artie's guitarist and leader, Mike Sistak, who shrugged and told them, "It's just business." The trio was stunned and jobless, but not for long. Terry's response was pure grit. He simply formed a new band. He recruited his two buddies into a new cover group called The Missing Links, and soon they were hustling gigs again around Illinois. Before long, they added a hotshot trumpet player, Lee Loughnane, whom Kath immediately befriended. Loughnane found Terry gruff on the outside, but a pussycat inside, and noted that Kath was never seen without a guitar in hand. "I don't think I ever saw that thing in its case," he laughed. By 1967, the nucleus of what would become Chicago was in place. But they were still formulating their master plan. Kath and his mates rechristened themselves The Big Thing, a slightly ironic name for a hungry young band still slogging through Chicago clubs. They then picked up keyboardist/singer Robert Lamb and trombonist Jimmy Pankow, and this expanded their lineup and musical range. Rounding out the group was bassist Peter Cetera, who was a golden voice singer with some marvelous pop instincts. The Big Thing was a peculiar sight in late 60s Chicago, a rock band with a full horn section trying to blend jazz improvisation with rock and roll grunt. Early on, they wore matching suits and even envisioned themselves as a slick, Vegas-style act playing lounges. But Terry Kath wasn't about to be a cookie-cutter lounge act. He had real rock ambitions. One night at a club called Barnaby's on State Street, Kath finally put his foot down in flamboyant fashion. Fed up with the clean-cut routine, he stormed on stage and literally tore off his suit mid-set, throwing the pieces aside in front of a shocked audience. "We only lasted about 6 months before Terry came on stage and ripped the suit right off of his back," Loughnane recalled. "It was t-shirts, jeans and long hair from then on." The band's visual makeover went hand in hand with a musical one. In their club sets, they started slipping in more experimental songs, even daring to play the Mothers of Invention's offbeat tune, "How Could I Be Such a Fool?" One Milwaukee club owner was so incensed by that weird detour that he fired The Big Thing on the spot. It was a clear sign. The group's true path was not playing polite top 40 covers. They wanted to fuse rock, soul, and jazz into something new. And if some conservative club bosses didn't like it, so be it. In mid-1968, fortune smiled on Terry Kath and company. An ambitious young producer named James William Guercio caught their act and was impressed by their sound, and Terry's raw guitar prowess in particular. Guercio had industry connections. He'd scored hits with the duo Chad and Jeremy, and he figured that this horn-driven rock band could be big. He signed The Big Thing to his production company and whisked them off to Los Angeles, where the music scene was exploding. With the move west came a new, more official name, Chicago Transit Authority, soon shortened simply to Chicago after the actual transit authority got pissed off. Under Guercio's guidance, Chicago landed a deal with Columbia Records and in early 1969 set about recording their debut album. The sessions produced by Guercio were intense, a double LP that tried to capture the sprawling energy of their live jams and genre-blending ambitions. Chicago's self-titled debut, eventually retroactively called Chicago Transit Authority, hit shelves in April 1969, and it was a revelation. The opening track, Introduction, was penned by Terry as a mission statement, a 6.5-minute epic, seamlessly blending rock, jazz and blues, all powered by Kath's soulful vocals and stinging guitar leads. Years later, drummer Danny Seraphine would still call Introduction the best opening cut on any album ever. I mean, he was probably a bit biased, but it's hard to argue with him. It's a hell of an announcement to the world. The album also featured an audacious experimental piece called Free-Form Guitar, 7 minutes of pure, unadulterated guitar improvisation by Kath, No pedals, just Terry plugged straight into a cranked-up amp, ripping sheets of feedback and distorted sound. The result was so otherworldly that, according to legend, even classical radio stations would sometimes slip free-form guitar into their late-night playlists. Terry had essentially created a noise symphony with his Fender. As Lee Loughnane later said, Kath was doing many of the same wild techniques as Jimi Hendrix, sustained howls of feedback, dive-bombing riffs, before we heard Hendrix do it. In fact, when Terry Kath first encountered Hendrix's music, he recognized a guy who saw the guitar the same way he did. Jimmy was playing all the stuff I had in my head, Terry marveled in a 1971 interview. The respect was mutual. After Chicago's debut came out, the band scored coveted spots opening for rock royalty. In June 1969, they found themselves on tour with none other than Hendrix and Janis Joplin. One night at Hollywood's Whiskey A Go-Go, Hendrix caught Chicago's set and was floored. According to Walt Parazada, Jimmy pulled him aside and said, "Your guitarist is better than me." Now Parazada has dined out on that quote for years, and though some 40 exaggerated, other witnesses back it up. Is it true? I don't know, but one thing's for sure, Hendrix knew a good player when he saw one, and he certainly rated Kath among the best. Seraphine also recalled Hendrix and his drummer Mitch Mitchell coming backstage to lavish praise. "You are the best band I've ever heard in my life," they told the wide-eyed Chicago musicians. Hearing such validation from the era's greatest guitar hero and his band did wonders for Terry's confidence. "It wasn't just good for our egos, it was good for our souls," Seraphine said of Hendrix's compliment. On stage, Terry Kath quickly proved he could hold his own against any guitar god of the day. As the lone guitarist competing with three horn players, he developed a muscular, aggressive style to cut through the brass. Trombonist Jimmy Pankow remembered Kath in the club days, smashing his Fender Telecaster against his amp a la The Who's Pete Townsend just to make it talk, conjuring wails of feedback and other sonic chaos. But Kath wasn't all brute force. He was ceaselessly inventive, deploying wah-wah pedals, fuzz distortion, and even early two-handed tapping techniques, years before Eddie Van Halen made them famous. He had a sound that no other guitar player could get. How in the world did he get a guitar to sound like that? Marveled Eagles guitarist Joe Walsh. The combination of Terry's fiery guitar, Chicago's horn arrangements, and a knack for melody started winning converts on both sides of the Atlantic. The debut album didn't exactly skyrocket to the top of the US charts. It peaked at a respectable number 17, but in the UK, it cracked the top 10. The band's blend of brass and rock was often compared to Blood, Sweat and Tears, another new horn rock act Columbia had signed. But as Seraphine said, Blood, Sweat and Tears didn't have our songs or our guitarist. By 1970, the whirlwind was in full force. Chicago released their second album, Chicago 2, which spawned the hit single 25 or 6-4, a riff-driven rocker that climaxed with an absolute barn burner of a guitar solo from Kath that fans would scream for in concert. Chicago 2 also featured Make Me Smile, a complex sweep piece sung by Kath in his distinctive Ray Charles-tinged baritone. At first, Pankow, who wrote Make Me Smile, wasn't sure who should sing it, but when he heard Terry belt it out in his rough, soulful voice, the choice was obvious. With back-to-back double albums and a string of FM radio hits, Chicago was fast becoming one of the hottest bands in the country. The grueling tour schedule reflected their rising stature. It was a relentless cycle that had them crisscrossing the globe without rest. Chicago's first trip to Europe in 1970 confirmed they were indeed international stars. At London's prestigious Royal Albert Hall, they played to a packed house where each band member was introduced individually and greeted with a thunderous standing ovation. Even jaded British rock journalists were impressed by the Chicago sound, but on a subsequent UK visit, Terry's temper got the better of him. At a London press conference, sick of hearing British reporters fawn over local guitar heroes like Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page, Kath lost his cool spectacularly. He blurted out that Clapton sucks, and then in a shocking tirade, shouted at the assembled press, "Fuck you, England, you motherfucking teabag faggot motherfuckers." The room fell into horrified silence. That queered us, Seraphine admitted of the incident. The band was mortified, and they quickly pulled Terry aside. Did you really just say that? He had, and there was no taking it back. Mind you, I will admit, we do like a tea bag or two over here, so that part wasn't wholly inaccurate, to be fair. The outburst made headlines, embarrassing his bandmates and tarnishing Chicago's reputation in the UK for years. It was an early glimpse of how volatile Terry Kath could be when provoked. Outspoken to a fault, he wasn't one to sugarcoat his opinions, whether about other musicians or anything else. If his behaviour off stage was sometimes erratic, on stage Terry was undeniably the leader of the pack. During jams, Kath acted as field general with a trademark high-pitched whistle that could cut through the din, the signal to wrap up solos and cue the band back to the song's bridge. Under his direction, Chicago's live shows in the early 70s were powerful and dynamic, with Kath's guitar serving as both hammer and glue in the ensemble. Even as hits mounted and fame beckoned, he kept the group grounded in the earthy, real sound of rock and blues. In July 1972, Chicago 5 became the band's first #1 album, and it proved that they could marry artistry and commercial appeal, which is the real sorcery of popular music. Songs like Saturday in the Park dominated radio. Chicago was on top of the world, but success had a way of planting the seeds of personal turmoil. By the mid-1970s, Chicago had achieved superstardom on a scale few could imagine. They ultimately sold over 100 million records, earned dozens of gold and platinum albums, and for a time had more hit singles in the 1970s than any other American band. But the grind of constant success took its toll on Terry. Night after night of playing massive arenas, often with rigid set lists and note-for-note solos to appease fans, left him feeling stifled. Kath chafed at repeating himself on stage. He was tired of the same licks he was playing, Loughnane observed, and he also pointed out a parallel with Jimi Hendrix's boredom playing the same songs over and over before his death. Terry was growing restless and unhappy, even as Chicago kept churning out hits. To cope with the stress and monotony, he increasingly turned to drugs and alcohol. The once casual indulgences of the road hardened into daily habits. Kath dove into the rock and roll excess with enthusiasm, and he had a prodigious tolerance. There was women, booze, drugs. We were kids, for Christ's sakes, Loughnane said of the era. During one frantic touring period, Seraphine even came down with tuberculosis, probably due to the exhaustion and endless late-night partying. The band was young and invincible, or so they thought, and Terry Kath could seemingly handle anything. In 1973, Terry's personal life hit also turbulence, even as his career was in skyrocket mode. He had married his first wife, Pamela Robinson, back in 1970 at the start of Chicago's rise. But the 5 years of marriage were rocky. The non-stop touring and Kath's hard partying ways strained their relationship to the breaking point. By 1975, the couple divorced. Friends described the marriage as extremely volatile. Fights, long separations, and the general chaos of the rock lifestyle made it untenable. Terry wasn't solo for long, though. He soon fell, head over heels, for a Los Angeles actress called Camelia Ortiz. In 1976, Kath and Camelia married, and that same year they welcomed a baby daughter, Michelle. Fatherhood seemed to soften Terry's wild side at least a little bit. Photos from 1977 show him proudly cradling little Michelle. But any domestic bliss was short-lived. Kath's demons were like an army of Terminators, never far behind, and he continued to lose himself in cocaine and alcohol just as before. It didn't help that Chicago's internal dynamics were growing strained. The band was essentially a seven-man democracy, and by the mid-70s, creative differences were widening. On one side, Terry and Danny Seraphine preferred Chicago's original adventurous jazz rock approach. On the other, Peter Cetera, backed at times by manager/producer Guercio, pushed for sleeker, softer songs tailored for radio hits. Tensions that had been simmering for years began to boil. Cetera's self-confidence, some called it ego, rubbed Kath the wrong way, going back to the early days. By most recollections, Kath and Cetera were never particularly close. They respected each other on stage, but clashed off stage, a classic oil and water combo. In the late 70s, as Cetera started writing big pop ballads and hogging more spotlight as a singer, Terry grew more frustrated. The music was changing in ways he didn't like. One pivotal moment came during the making of Chicago 10 in 1976. Cetera had written a syrupy, orchestrated love song called If You Leave Me Now. Terry reportedly hated it. It was a long way from the horn-driven rock he loved. The song was almost left off the album, but at the last minute, Guitarist insisted it be included. Terry was so disinterested that he literally bunked off the recording session to go ride his motorcycle. Of course, If You Leave Me Now became Chicago's first #1 hit single and a worldwide smash. It also firmly established the band's soft rock future, much to Terry's annoyance. You can't deny its success, Loughnane said of the song's impact, but to Terry it didn't feel like Chicago anymore. And the fact that the biggest hit didn't even feature his guitar must have stung quite a lot. Meanwhile, Kath's indulgences were catching up with him and fast. Cocaine was rampant in the music scene, and by 1977, Terry was using heavily, often staying up for days on end in a blitz of creativity and carnage. Chicago decamped to Caribou Ranch, a secluded studio in the Colorado Rockies, owned by Guitarist, to record in a party-like atmosphere. That's when the drugs got heavier and things got weirder, Seraphine recalled. There was cocaine everywhere. A TV documentary filmed at Caribou in 74 shows Terry zipping around on a motorbike with a glazed 1,000-yard stare. It was obvious he hadn't slept, pupils blown wide open from coke. His bandmates noticed that Terry's once boundless joy was evaporating. Jimmy Pankow later revealed that by this point he was incredibly unhappy and depressed, and doing drugs on top of that compounded the situation. Indeed, the ever-perceptive Terry himself knew he was on a destructive path. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he confided to Danny Seraphine that he needed to get his drug use under control before it killed him. Kath also picked up a new hobby in these years, and it was one that mixed dangerously with his substance abuse. He had always enjoyed target shooting, but now it became an obsession. Terry started collecting guns, amassing pistols, rifles, even an automatic weapon or two. He often brought firearms on tour, to the alarm of some around him. The gentle soul from Chicago now had a dark edge, high on cocaine, fiddling with loaded guns, brooding alone in hotel rooms after shows, like a 6-foot version of Phil Spector or something. Band members grew concerned that Terry was spiraling. His second marriage, to Camellia, hit rough patches as he continued his benders. The pressures of fame, the creative conflicts, the personal demons, all of it weighed on Kath's broad shoulders. Still, the idea of leaving the band he founded was hard to contemplate. Some around him wondered if Terry might quit Chicago to save himself. He was planning to record a solo album, and that might have helped exorcise some demons, Loughnane said. But before any such project could happen, time was running out for Terry Kath. By January 1978, Chicago were at a crossroads. They had finally severed ties with James Guitarist and were free from his iron grip. A new manager was in, and a new chapter seemed possible. But internally, the band was frayed and hurting. Chicago was still an amazing band, but it wasn't such a happy band, Seraphine admitted of that period. For Terry especially, the end of 1977 was bleak. He was just 31, yet years of hard living had aged him beyond his age, physically and emotionally. Friends say he oscillated between upbeat enthusiasm and morose depression. He dearly loved his infant daughter, but his addictions kept him from fully embracing family life. "I'm sure if I don't do something, this will kill me," he told his mates about his drug habit. Plans were even made for Terry to take a break and get clean after one last party at his roadie's house. But fate had a cruel twist in store. On the evening of January the 22nd, 1978, Terry paid a visit to percussionist Laudir de Oliveira, a Brazilian musician who had joined Chicago's lineup in recent years. In contrast to the usual craziness, this was a relatively mellow hangout. At Laudir's home, the two sipped tea, yes, just normal tea, quite surprisingly, and jammed acoustic, talking about the future and putting out a few ideas for new music. Those around Terry were heartened. Maybe he was finally looking ahead, making plans beyond the next high. Unbeknownst to both men, this quiet night would be Terry's last peaceful moment alive. The next day, January 23rd, 1978, Kath decided to drop by the Woodland Hills apartment of a friend, Don Johnson, one of Chicago's longtime roadies and a frequent drug buddy of Terry's. A small gathering had taken place there earlier, a going-away party of sorts, as the band was due to head to Los Angeles for rehearsals. By the time Terry showed up, the other guests were gone. It was just him and Johnson in the small Canoga Park flat on a Monday evening. Terry Kath was still riding the tail end of a coke binge, despite the calm of the previous evening. Strung out and sleepless, Kath nonetheless appeared in good spirits, coked up but jovial. As was his habit, he had brought along two of his guns, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and a .38 revolver. After hours of partying, Terry's adrenaline was still pumping, and at some point, past 11 p.m., he started fooling around with his weapons. He loved to do quick draws, spin revolvers on his finger, silly macho stuff that normally got some laughs. He picked up the .38 revolver and playfully spun the cylinder, even putting it to his head and pulling the trigger with an empty chamber, like a macabre game of Russian roulette. Click, no bullet. Don Johnson, growing nervous, implored him to stop. This was no joke to be messing with guns, especially not in Terry's frazzled state. But Kath just smiled. Next, Terry reached for his other firearm, the 9mm semi-auto. It had a removable magazine, which he popped out to show Johnson. "Look, the clip is not even in it," he said calmly. To further reassure his friend, Terry even handed over the clip to demonstrate it was unloaded, then waved the empty pistol with a devilish smirk. What's there to worry about? Who knows why he did what he did next, but he then did the unthinkable. He raised the 9mm to his own temple. "What do you think I'm going to do? Blow my brains out?" he said. They were the last words he would ever speak. In the next instant, Terry pulled the trigger. He had forgotten one crucial detail. Even with the clip removed, a single round can remain in the chamber. A sudden, ear-splitting bang echoed through the apartment. The bullet, the one Terry hadn't realized was there, entered his head just above the temple. Terry Kath fell backwards onto the couch, the gun clattering to the floor. He was killed instantly. Don Johnson froze in horror. For a moment he thought it was another prank, but the sight before him was all too real. Blood was splattered on the wall. Terry's body lay askew, his eyes open yet unseeing. Johnson went into shock, collapsing in a corner and screaming. At that very time, driving in his car, Danny Seraphine received a frantic call on his newfangled car phone. "Danny, are you sitting down?" said the manager. "Terry's been in an accident." Seraphine floored it to Johnson's apartment. He arrived to a devastating scene. Terry's lifeless body was sat back on the couch, his head angled toward the ceiling, Seraphine later described. 2 steps forward revealed a bullet hole in the side of his head. His eyes were wide open, staring off blankly. The tough drummer broke down sobbing. He found Johnson trembling and hysterical in the corner, utterly inconsolable. Within minutes, police and an ambulance pulled up, their flashing lights painting the night blue and red. Paramedics knew there was nothing to be done. The 31-year-old rock star was gone. Even removing Terry's body was an ordeal. The coroner arrived and, noting Kath's hefty frame, he was well over 200 pounds and over 6 feet tall, struggled to fit him into a standard body bag. Terry's size 12 snakeskin boots protruded from the end of the bag, and they couldn't zip it closed. Seraphine was asked to help lift his friend's corpse, but he physically couldn't bring himself to touch Terry. He was so overcome with grief. In the early hours of January the 24th, 1978, the Los Angeles Coroner's Office recorded the death. Terry Kath, aged 31, accidental gunshot wound to head. News of Kath's shocking death spread quickly and left fans and friends reeling. Rumours swirled in the press that it might have been suicide. After all, people knew Terry had been depressed and flirting with danger. But those closest to him vehemently denied he'd intentionally take his life. "It was a stupid accident," sighed Lee Loughnane. The band pointed to Don Johnson's account and the fact that Terry had been in generally good spirits about the future. Yes, he was troubled and battling addiction, but he hadn't left a note or any sign of a willful desire to end his life. It appeared to be exactly what it looked like, a dreadful, impulsive mistake by a guy who probably didn't fully grasp how impaired he was at that moment, and clearly didn't know how to handle his guns as well as he ought to. There's no doubt guns and drugs are a bad combination. The death of Terry Kath could easily have spelled the end of Chicago. In fact, in the days after the tragedy, the remaining members did consider breaking up. How could they go on without their leader and guitar virtuoso? The initial shock was immense. At Terry's funeral in Chicago, each bandmate filed past the coffin in disbelief. Loughnane gently touched Kath's body and was struck by the emptiness. It was just a shell. Terry had gone, he said, heartbroken. For a while, Chicago was paralyzed by grief and uncertainty. Ultimately, it was one of their musical friends, Doc Severinsen, the Tonight Show bandleader, who urged them not to throw in the towel. Terry himself, they knew, would have wanted the music to continue. So they resolved to carry on in his honor. Just weeks after Kath's death, the 6 surviving members cautiously entered the studio to record an album, Hot Streets. They auditioned over 30 guitarists to fill Terry's role, an unenviable task, as no one could truly replace him. The slot eventually went to Donnie Dacus, a talented young player who had worked with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Dacus had the blonde rock star look, some thought he resembled Peter Frampton, and he could sing and play well enough. But joining Chicago in 1978 was stepping onto a sinking ship of emotions. Donnie had the image, Seraphine said, trailing off, but we were still reeling from Terry's death. Dacus lasted only 2 albums before departing. The late 70s were rough for Chicago. Hot Streets and its follow-up did moderately well, but the band's spirit and sound were changed forever. They did pay tribute to Kath on Hot Streets. The lead single, Alive Again, was written as a tribute to Terry's memory, a musical phoenix rising from the tragedy. It became Chicago's first hit after his passing, cracking the top 20 and signaling that the group could survive, at least commercially. Still, as the years went on, the band without Terry Kath became almost a different entity. In the 1980s, Chicago reinvented itself with power ballads like Hard to Say I'm Sorry and You're the Inspiration, driven by Peter Cetera's songwriting and vocals. The new sound brought enormous hits and new fans, but long-time listeners knew it wasn't the fiery jazz rock ensemble of old. The gritty guitar edge, the freewheeling jam ethos, much of that had died with Terry in 1978. For a long time, Terry Kath's legacy hovered in the shadows. Chicago adopted a flat band philosophy where no one member was thrust out front as a superstar, which meant Kath never attained the household name guitar god status of contemporaries like Hendrix, Page, or Clapton. Unfortunately, his guitar playing has been overlooked, probably because of being in such a large band, particularly a brass-oriented band, Loughnane has said. Indeed, rock history books often gave Chicago a brief mention as a horn band with Cetera's ballads, glossing over the fact that in the early 70s, they were one of the most adventurous and successful rock acts because of Terry Kath's contributions on guitar. Those in the know, however, always sung his praises. Hendrix's famous compliment is only one example. Others who saw Kath play live often came away awestruck. If Terry had been in a trio, he probably would have been right up there with Jimi Hendrix, Loughnane insists, and he means in public renown, not just skill. To his bandmates and peers, Terry was every bit the guitar legend, just without the wider acclaim. A curious story unfolded after his death, involving his famous pig-nose Telecaster guitar, and in fact, a large part of his guitar collection, and the result was actually a very moving moment. For decades after Terry Kath's death, the sound of his guitar seemed to fade into myth, and so, it turned out, had the guitars themselves. His daughter, Michelle Kath Sinclair, was only 2 when he died. She grew up knowing her father more through old records and grainy footage than through anything she could touch. Years later, determined to understand the man behind the music, she began work on a documentary. In the process, she opened a long-forgotten box of family memorabilia, and inside she found a breadcrumb trail that would change everything. Letters, receipts, and a few faded photographs hinted at where her father's instruments might have gone. One clue led to another, and eventually to a suburban garage belonging to the son of Terry's former guitar tech. There, under layers of dust and time, was the instrument fans had long thought vanished, the battered Fender Telecaster with the twin pig-nose stickers, the one that had screamed and wailed through 25 or 6-4. Its lacquer was cracked, its pickups worn, but its soul was unmistakable. For Michelle, holding that guitar was like touching her father's heartbeat. It was as if he was right there, she later said. The recovery of that Telecaster and several other long-lost instruments, including a Stratocaster, a Gibson SG Custom, and an Ovation acoustic, became the emotional centerpiece of her film The Terry Kath Experience. What began as a daughter's search for information ended as a resurrection of sound, proof that even decades after his death, Terry Kath's music could still find its way home. Terry's tragic death at 31 robbed the world of a singular talent, but his music, those electrifying solos, that husky baritone on Make Me Smile and Color My World, the adventurous spirit he instilled in Chicago's songs, well, all that continues on. Today, more and more people are recognizing what his bandmates knew all along. Terry Kath was one of rock's greatest, taken far too soon. Alright, quite a few of you requested this one, and it was a very interesting one to put together. So, I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know which version of Chicago you like best, the soft rock ballads or the wilder stuff from the early years. And what do you reckon to Terry as a guitarist? Does he rank up there with Hendrix, Clapton and co? Leave me a comment with your thoughts, and be sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and why not share it with a friend. I've been Chester, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.